Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join us as we learn from area professors and teachers as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for today. Now, here is today's program.
Good morning, and thanks for joining us again for another lesson in the Word. We're grateful to have another opportunity to explore the Psalms. Dave?
Looking at them again.
Yeah, it's good. And the Psalms are such a rich resource for spiritual meditation and thought. And these three Psalms focus on the nature of God. They overlap a good bit. Mm-hmm. They emphasize the power of God to protect mm-hmm. and to care for His people. Mm-hmm. And that's a reminder that we need to.
The Psalms are so rich because there are so many different things expressed there in the worship and praise of God mm-hmm. in every circumstance of life. It's partly why a lot of us read a Psalm every day. Mm-hmm. Just the idea of there's a new message each day, mm-hmm. and sometimes it's amazing how it fits the day. Mm. It just hits.
Yeah. Well, we've discussed recently just how many types of psalms there were. Mm-hmm. Like you say, there's psalms of praise and thanks, and focused on formal worship at the temple. You mentioned wisdom recently, and this most common of all, the lament psalm. Mm-hmm. The psalm we're studying today is clearly a praise song, isn't it?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Yeah. And by the way, it's that word praises that gives the title, the Hebrew title to the book of Psalms. Mm-hmm. Psalms, it means praises. So we've got a really good praise psalm today. The NIV translation, which our quarterly follows, leaves out all the little prefaces at the mm-hmm. heads of many of the Psalms, mm-hmm. which tell us about sometimes musical matters, like which instruments should be used, right? Stringed instruments or
and sometimes the hymn tune.
Yes, the name of the tune, because they evidently didn't write out the notes.
Right.
People just memorized tunes. Mm-hmm. And so sing this one to the dove on the far-off terebinths.
Yeah,
so that was the name of a tune. That always struck me as a beautiful phrase. Yeah. And then sometimes the author or who it's dedicated to or written for. This one is one of many that says it's written for the choir director.
The leader.
The leader of the choir. Sometimes it's translated chief musician. Mm-hmm. And we talked last week about how there was a choir and orchestra of Levites mm-hmm. that assisted worship at the temple that you could listen to.
In addition to the priests, there was a staff, if you will, mm-hmm. of leaders musically and servants, the people who took care of the physical aspects of the temple.
Yeah. And we've talked, just by way of reminder, about the chief poetic character of these psalms, parallelism. People will notice that in this psalm as well. We haven't mentioned for a long time an odd term that turns up in many of the psalms, mm-hmm. but is always left out of the NIV translation.
Right,
Yeah, so why don't you tell us a little bit about this?
Selah, S-E-L-A-H.
Okay.
And it's in the right-hand margin usually, in the poetic portions of the Psalms. And some people will read it, some people won't read it. They don't know what to do with it. What does it mean?
Right.
We don't know.
Yeah, it's fascinating. The word turns up so often, periodically in the Psalms, and maybe that's why the NIV leaves it out. Not only is it a strange word, but we have no clue what it means.
Well,
there is a guess.
Yeah, the strongest indication seems to be it was a musical notation, probably an indication of an instrumental interlude.
Yes.
In the process of singing, it's a time for the riff on the guitars or whatever.
The choir stops the the worship band stopped singing and
Yeah.
let the instruments play for a
Yeah.
little while or something. Yeah, the word seems to mean something like pause or interlude,
Mm-hmm.
and it may be an instrumental interlude. It may have just been a cessation of sound.
Pause. Yeah.
A pause. Just
Yeah.
sing and then be
Think about
silent
it.
for a while,
Yeah, think about this.
which is not a bad idea.
Yeah.
And then take it up again and pause.
Mm-hmm.
We're thinking about it today because the word does appear 3 times
Right.
in Psalm
Only 2
66.
of the verses we've got, but it comes after verse 4 and again after verse 7 and then after verse 15, which we don't have in our text today.
Yeah. So at any rate, some of our viewers may be using their own Bibles of other translations
Yeah.
that do have the word Selah in it, and so we thought we hadn't mentioned that for a long time. Maybe we should.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and read our text so we have time to talk about it.
Okay, it's Psalm 66, verses 1 through 9 and then 16 through 20. Shout for joy to God, all the earth. Sing the glory of his name. Make his praise glorious. Say to God, how awesome are your deeds. So great is your power that your enemies cringe before you. All the earth bows down to you. They sing praise to you. They sing the praises of your name. Come and see what God has done, his awesome deeds for mankind. He turned the sea into dry land. They passed through the waters on foot. Come, let us rejoice in him. He rules forever by his power. His eyes watch the nations. Let not the rebellious rise up against him. Praise our God, all peoples. Let the sound of his praise be heard. He has preserved our lives and kept our feet from slipping. Come and hear, all you who fear God. Let me tell you what he has done for me. I cried out to him with my mouth. His praise was on my tongue. If I had cherished sin in my heart, the Lord would not have listened. But God has surely listened and has heard my prayer. Praise be to God, who has not rejected my prayer or withheld his love from me.
Climaxes with the word love, doesn't it?
It
That
does.
word. There's that word hesed that we
Yes.
talked about last week. Well, we'll work our way toward love. We know that the love of God is at the end of our study today. Well, this psalm starts off with pure praise, doesn't it?
Yes.
Shout for joy to the Lord. Shout it. The word joy is not actually in the Hebrew text. It's implied. I think it just says, "Shout to the Lord," and the word "shout" could be a shout of alarm or fear or joy, and here obviously it is a shout of joy.
So that's part of the expression of worship. When you're so filled with the wonder of God, you might as well shout it.
Yeah. So we have the shouting and singing here. The word "sing" is a musical term. It actually, its root has to do with strumming a stringed instrument, but as an accompaniment to singing is the idea there. I wanted folks to notice how universal the setting of these first 4 verses is. It's all the earth praising God. It's not just covenant people gathered for worship. All the earth praises God. All the earth bows down to God in verse 4. So there's a very universal feel. And that's going to kind of evolve and change as we move through this psalm. So it's worth noticing there. All the earth is shouting out to God.
And that's part of what we find in, like first chapter of Romans, that the wonders of the world, people have a hard time ignoring it.
Yeah. And he says even Gentiles, even people who didn't have the law or the revelation of the Old Testament, should have heard the shout of creation, as it were. He doesn't use that word, but should have heard the shouting out the glory of God. That word glory can mean splendor or honor of God. And the word praise there in verse 1 is that word halal that we talked about last week, the source of our word hallelujah. And there's name again. We've had many occasions to remind ourselves that name doesn't mean the literal name of God, but the person of God, the character of God,
Yeah.
the personal authority of God. Now, verse 3 has this word awesome in it.
Yes.
And that's a word that has been overused at some times in recent history, don't you think?
So much.
Yeah.
In so many contexts
Yeah,
that don't
awesome, you know.
Yeah.
But here it's a context that really fits,
Yes.
isn't it? I looked the word up, and it's interesting how often it has a very negative connotation. It can be translated dread, or terror, or fearsome, or terrible, or awful, awful.
Yeah.
And in our mind, or my mind at least, all of those words have a very negative connotation. But here, it's definitely been turned around. And if you think of everything that's dreadful or awful or terrible and now make it good, that's the way we think of God, awesome rather than all full.
And you know, Hesed has a little bit of that nature too. That sometimes some of the particular uses of Hesed seem negative, and yet it's this covenant, unfailing love of God.
Okay.
Part of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So awesome. Glory to his name, that's his person, his nature, and then how awesome are your deeds. There's the focus, the two focuses here, who God is and what God has done. Yeah, so it's very nice.
Yeah.
Very nice. God is described as powerful at the end of verse 3, naturally. Here we get the idea of worship in verse 4, bowing down. That's the concept of worship, and once again a reference to the name. And then this concludes the first section, and that's where we get a Selah, right? You said at the end.
And that, you know, as you mentioned, that all the earth bows down to you, they sing praise to you, sounds like what we studied in Philippians chapter 2, that at the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow,
yeah.
tongue confess.
That is very similar to that. Right. Sing praise. So we start off with this beautiful focus on praise. Now, starting in verse 5, the focus shifts a little bit more to what God has done. We saw that we had both, who God is and what God has done. Now it really shifts to what God has done or is doing. And I get the feeling like the psalmist is talking more to the covenant people of God here, because he has historical references to their experience.
They know the background.
Yeah, they know
the
it.
Exodus experience, especially.
Right. So we've moved from a universal focus of praise of God, all the earth, to a more communal, covenantal approach here. Well, come and see, he invites the covenant people. Look at the works of God. There's the word awesome again. So I guess we should be okay with it. Now look, verse 6, you use the word Exodus experience. You think that's what's going on here?
Well, he turned the sea into dry land, passed through the waters on foot.
Yeah.
But some translations use the word river.
Yeah, and the word sea in the first line of verse 6 literally means river.
Yeah.
But then by extension, any body of water. So sometimes it's used of the Nile, sometimes of the Euphrates. So
And so it could be he's talking about the Red Sea or Sea of Reeds as they came out of Egypt.
Yeah.
Could be Jordan River as they crossed into the Promised Land.
yeah,
Or it just could be in general how God makes the way for us.
yeah.
But it sounds like the specifics of their history.
Yeah, and the Exodus experience so dominated the thought of Israelite people throughout their history
Yes.
that we wouldn't be surprised if this psalmist is focusing on the reminder of that.
Yeah.
But yeah, it could be crossing of the Jordan. Well, verse 6 ends with a call to rejoice in him, which of course is a synonym for praise.
Which sounds like, again, the lessons we had in Philippians where Paul's
does.
talking about rejoicing.
Rejoice,
Now
and
we're-
again I say rejoice,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. I love the root meaning of the word rejoice in Hebrew. It's sparkle. We need to just sparkle for God. I think that's so interesting. Well, verse 7 talks more about God's power, which we saw referenced back up in verse 3. He rules by his power. Now here, whereas all the earth was worshiping God in verses 1 through 4, here there's a reference to nations, but God is keeping his eyes
watch the nations.
On nations.
Yes.
And it's the word goyim, the Gentiles, is what that is.
The peoples, yeah.
I'm not sure who the rebellious are. Let not the rebellious rise up. It literally means those who turn away. So it doesn't necessarily refer to like a military rebellion, but anyone in the covenant people who turns away from the worship of God, maybe, or any other nations who hear about God but turn away. In other words, reject his worship. If there's some other rebellion in mind, I don't know what it is. And this is where we have another Selah.
Right.
At the end of verse 7. Well, we're back to praise in verse 8, but the word is a little different here. It's the word barak. There's a character in the Old Testament named Barak, right, in Judges. And that can be translated bless. So bless our God, all peoples. Well, here we're back to kind of a universal theme, aren't we? Sound of praise. And then we have in verse 9 a reason for praising God or blessing God, which we haven't seen quite so much. Well, we have some. He turned the sea into dry land. That's a reason for praise. He rules us, watches over the nations. Here we have yet another reason. He's preserved our lives.
Preserved our lives and kept our feet from slipping.
Yeah. What do you think that poetic language is meant to say about God?
Well, his sustenance, he keeps us alive, keeps us going, but kept our feet from slipping. It sounds like walking a mountain trail in the danger of slipping off and falling to your death. Yeah. But God keeps us from slipping in terms of just sliding away. If it's by accident, God keeps us from. Now, if we choose to turn from God, that's the rebellious we were talking about. But slipping is the idea of falling away and it's accidental and nothing could be done. God keeps that from happening.
Keeps us on the path, as it were. Did you read that there have been hundreds, I'm not exaggerating, hundreds of deaths in national parks by people trying to take selfies. And they keep stepping back toward the edge of cliffs so they get a better picture and fall to their death. So at any rate, for some reason, that crossed my mind. Keep our feet from slipping. I think that's just...
Keep us from taking selfies.
Careless. Maybe that's what we need. Well, it's at this point in the psalm that the printed text disappears from us. Verses 10 through 15 are not here. Here the psalmist talks rather personally about planning to take offerings to the temple as thanksgiving for some deliverance. So here the psalm turns into a little bit of a psalm of thanks rather than a psalm of praise. But then when that is finished, we come back to our printed text in verse 16. Now we had come and see in verse 5. Here in 16, we get come and hear. And the people who are called to come and hear God are those who fear God, all those who fear God. For those of us who watch our lessons regularly, I know we've talked about this before, and I hesitate to bring it up so we aren't too redundant. But it could be that someone is watching today who has never heard us discuss this. What does it mean to fear God? Isn't that a negative concept? And why would a believer ever fear God?
Yeah, it's not fear in the sense of being afraid or cowering before God, but it's reverence. It's the respect of God and the recognition of his authority and his power. But it's part of the love of God because we we know who he is, and we respect and reverence him, and we respect his power.
Yeah.
But we love him. That's
Yeah.
the key.
And we know that his power is used in protective ways for his covenant people. I think this psalm may be a really good place to understand this positive concept of fear. It starts off talking about how awesome God is.
Right.
And apart from our trust in God, that word could mean terrible or dreadful, but it doesn't. It means awe-inspiring. And we've learned that this awe-inspiring God does things for our benefit. Gets us across the sea, rules us in a benevolent way, protects us, preserves
and that shows up
us.
in verse 16, after saying, all you who fear God, then it's saying, let me tell you what he's done for me.
Yeah. It's not let me tell you what he's done to me as if God were the enemy, but done in my behalf. Well, the other thing we need to point out here in verse 16 is that suddenly the psalm turns very personal, and the pronouns are singular.
Yes.
We started off with a focus on kind of a universal focus. All the earth shouts. And then we moved toward a more covenantal purpose, the communal people of God. And now things have gotten very personal. Let me tell you what he has done for me.
Yeah.
And then we get I and my and me all the way through the end of verse 20. The crying out to God in some psalms, like Psalms of Lament, is crying out like, God, why did you let this happen
Protest
to me?
almost,
Yeah, right. But here, I think it's different, don't you? Because here's a good example of parallelism. So if our question is, what does that first line mean? I cried out to God with my mouth. Does it mean crying out with complaint? Or does it mean, or protest, like you say, or does it mean crying out with praise and thanks? Well, we get the answer, don't we?
His praise was on my tongue.
Yes. So, and by the way, this word praise is yet a little different. We had the one rooted in halal, praise. We had the one rooted in barak, bless. And this one has a root that suggests exaltation, lifting up God. So just slightly different synonyms on this word for praise. Verse 18 is a beautiful verse because it reminds us that God listens to us, and that theme is carried over into verse 19.
It's an interesting thought here, though, because it says, if I had cherished sin in my heart, the Lord would not have listened. And it raises the question, are there times God doesn't listen to prayers?
Well, that is a fascinating question. I think there have been times in my life where I sinned deliberately, and I knew I should be praying for forgiveness, and I did pray for forgiveness, but my will was still focused on sin. I mean, I kept sinning intentionally even while I was praying for forgiveness.
Yeah.
And I am prepared to believe that God did not forgive me at that time because I was so willfully focused on sin. Does that make sense?
Yes,
Is that possible?
I think it does. And I think it's, some of the promises in Jesus' ministry about God giving whatever we ask in his name.
Oh, yeah.
And that, again, is not just saying the title Jesus at the end of a prayer, but it's praying with God's concern in mind, praying the way Jesus wants us to pray. And that's the kind of promise that we have, that he makes to us. But it isn't, I guess, I have a hard time thinking God doesn't listen in the sense he doesn't even hear, but he's not listening in the sense of answering the prayer because it's not a good prayer. It's not for our benefit.
Yeah. Maybe done with wrong motives. It may be done thoughtlessly. it may be done not within his will. I mean, with no intention to conform to God's will, just hoping that we have this easy out of prayer and a request for forgiveness, as if it kind of covers over whatever sin we willfully commit.
Jeremiah chapter 11 talks to the people of Judah that some of their prayers in worship are not being heard by God because they are so insincere and corrupt. And so it's the same idea that the psalmist is saying here, that if I really were off the relationship with God to the point where I'm just going through the perfunctory motion of prayer, he wouldn't have listened. But the relationship with God is such that he did listen to me.
Yeah. Well, that's a good reminder. Thanks for bringing up that first line in verse 18. Ultimately, what we have here is a beautiful promise that if we pray sincerely into God's will, He listens and responds. By the way, the word Lord in verse 18 is not all caps, and that's an indication that the word Adonai lies behind it, rather than the word Yahweh.
The Master.
Yeah. Well, the passage ends with the word blessed again, Barak. Blessed be God who has not rejected my prayer or withheld his hesed from me. And we end on that beautiful note of covenant love. Well, for this short passage from Psalm 66, I just was overwhelmed in the way in which God's deeds were described in so many different ways. And I thought it might be worthwhile concluding with a look at that list. Verse 3 mentions God's power. His awesome deeds are mentioned in verse 5. His rule, he rules over us according to verse 7, keeps watch over the nations in verse 7, preserves us, that's down in verse 9, preserves our lives and protects us, the slipping foot there that you were talking about. And then as we were just talking in verse 18, listens to us. As the climax of all of this is that God shows hesed
He loves it.
to his people. Steadfast love, unfailing love, covenant love. And how do we respond to all of this? This psalm talks about some ways of responding too, doesn't it?
We can shout, we can sing, we can
Shout
praise,
for joy.
but we can keep that relationship.
And pray earnestly. He says, he has not rejected my prayer as well. Bow down is another phrase that's in here, suggesting our worship.
Come and see, come and hear.
Yes, and then the word rejoice at the end of verse 6. So this psalm gives us a number of meaningful ways in which to respond to the awesome deeds and to consider what God has done for us. Well, what a triumphant song. We had a Christocentric passage in Philippians recently, and now we have a theocentric passage here in Psalm 66. I hope you can celebrate with us the goodness and awesomeness of our God this week, and we hope to see you again next week.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson brought to you as a ministry of First Christian Church in Johnson City, Tennessee. Our thanks to our teachers that led us for this week's lesson. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of First Christian Church.